you want to know something funny? Mark's old college roommate slurred, already 3 beers in at our reunion dinner. Remember Jessica from sophomore year? My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Jessica. The name hit like a punch to the gut. She'd been one of Mark's just friends, who'd visited our apartment several times when we were dating long distance during college. Oh God, Tom, shut up, Mark cut in sharply, but the damage was already done. I saw the panic in his eyes, the same look he'd had 10 years ago during our first marriage crisis. I'm Sarah, and at 43, I just discovered my high school sweetheart and husband of 20 years had been lying to me since before we said, I do. The drive home that night was silent. Our daughter Emily was staying at a friend's house, so it was just us and the weight of unspoken words. I watched Mark's knuckles turn white on the steering wheel, waiting for him to speak first. When we finally got home, I didn't even take off my coat before asking, who else besides Jessica? Mark collapsed onto our living room couch, suddenly looking every bit his 44 years. Sarah, that was literally decades ago. Does it even matter now? How many, Mark? He ran his hands through his graying hair, the same nervous gesture I'd seen 1,000 times before. 3, he finally admitted. Including Jessica. But only during those first 2 years of college when we were apart. 3 women. All of whom he'd later introduced to me as friends. 20 years of memories suddenly shifted, like a kaleidoscope turning to reveal an ugly new pattern. The revelation hit harder because all 3 women had sat at our wedding. They'd brought gifts, hugged me, wished us well, all while knowing. I'd even kept in touch with Jessica on Facebook until a few years ago, liking her vacation photos and congratulating her on her promotions. It was college, Mark kept saying, as if that explained everything. We were young and the long-distance thing was hard. You were at UCLA, I was at NYU. It just happened. Just happened? 3 times? My voice stayed surprisingly steady. And you let these women into our lives afterward? Let me befriend them? Mark tried to reach for my hand. I pulled away. Sarah, please. That was literally half our lives ago. We have a beautiful daughter, a gorgeous house, 20 years of marriage. Are you really going to let ancient history destroy all that? I walked to our kitchen, the one we'd remodeled together 5 years ago, picking out each granite tile like it was a major life decision. Now I wondered what else had been happening during that time. The late nights at the office. The business trips. The texts he'd always angle away from my view. Ancient history doesn't usually show up drunk at reunions to spill secrets, I said, pouring myself a glass of water. My hands shook slightly, but I managed not to spill. The next morning, I called my parents. I should have known better. Mom's first words were, "Oh honey, but that was so long ago. Men do stupid things when they're young." Dad chimed in from their kitchen extension. "Marriage takes work, sweetheart. You've built a life together. Think about Emily." Even Mark's parents, when he inevitably called them, reached out to me. His mother left a tearful voicemail about forgiveness and family unity. His father sent a long email about the importance of working through rough patches. But they didn't understand. This wasn't about the affairs themselves, though those hurt enough. It was about 20 years of lies. About looking at our wedding photos and realizing 3 of the smiling guests had been part of an elaborate deception. About wondering what else I didn't know. I started sleeping in our guest room. Emily, perceptive at 17, noticed the tension immediately when she came home. "Mom, is everything okay?" she asked one morning, finding me drinking coffee alone at 5 a.m. "Just some things your dad and I need to work through," I said, trying to smile. But teenagers can smell lies like sharks smell blood, and Emily had inherited my determination to uncover truth. "Is it about what Uncle Tom said at the reunion?" she asked. "Dad's been weird ever since that night." I looked at my daughter. seeing my own strength reflected in her eyes. She deserved better than the web of lies I'd been living in. We both did. That conversation with Emily gave me the push I needed. The next day, I reached out to Tom, Mark's old roommate. He was apologetic about spilling the beans, but now that the dam had broken, he had more to say. "Look, Sarah," he said during our coffee meetup, nervously stirring his latte. "There's something else you should know. That rough patch in your marriage 10 years ago? When Mark said he was working late with Claire from accounting?" My stomach dropped. I remembered that time all too well. Mark had been distant, always at the office, claiming they were preparing for a major audit. I'd found lipstick on his collar once, but he convinced me it was from Claire hugging him in gratitude for his help with a difficult project. "It wasn't just work, was it?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Tom shook his head. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have told you then." Mark swore it was over, that it was just a mistake, and I believed him. Wanted to believe him. I sat back in my chair, memories rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces finally finding their proper places. The mysterious phone calls. The weekend business trips that produced no expense reports. The way Claire had suddenly transferred to another branch with no explanation. But what really got me was what Tom said next. "And Sarah, I've seen him having lunch with Jenny from HR pretty regularly lately. Always at this little cafe far from the office. They seem close." Jenny. The new hire Mark had mentioned bringing onto his team just 3 months ago. The one he'd said reminded him of me when I was younger. The pieces weren't just falling into place anymore, they were crashing down around me. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. While Mark was in the shower, I checked his phone. The password was still Emily's birthday. He'd always been sentimental that way. What I found made my blood run cold. Messages to Jenny. "Miss you already. Can't wait for tomorrow. Wish I could wake up next to you every morning." There were photos too. Nothing explicit, thank God, but intimate enough. Coffee dates. Hidden moments in what looked like hotel lobbies. Her head on his shoulder, both of them laughing. When Mark came out of the shower, I was sitting on our bed, his phone in my hand. He saw my face and knew. "Sarah, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. 20 years ago with Jessica and the others. 10 years ago with Claire. And now Jenny. My voice was ice. "It's not about being young and stupid anymore, is it, Mark? It's just who you are." He tried to argue, to minimize, to explain. Said Jenny was just a friend, that I was overreacting, that everyone had workplace friendships. But the pattern was clear now, stark as day. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not the family lawyer we'd used for years, my own lawyer. Mark's face when I told him showed real fear for the first time. He'd expected me to cave like before, to accept his explanations and apologies. To think about our daughter, our house, our life together. But I was thinking about Emily. About what message it would send her if I stayed, accepting this pattern of betrayal as just something women had to endure. About the kind of marriage I wanted her to see as normal. When I told her I was filing for divorce, she hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mom." The divorce proceedings moved quickly, partly because I had documentation of everything now, and partly because Mark seemed to realize fighting would only make things worse. His relationship with Jenny had become public knowledge at work, damaging his carefully crafted professional image. Several female colleagues came forward with stories of inappropriate behavior, and suddenly the rising star of the accounting department was facing an HR investigation. I kept things civil for Emily's sake, but I was done playing the understanding wife. When Mark's lawyer suggested I keep the house in exchange for a smaller portion of his retirement accounts, my lawyer countered with evidence of his pattern of infidelity and financial records showing suspicious hotel charges spanning years. We settled on an even split of all assets. Emily chose to live with me, a decision that visibly wounded Mark but didn't surprise anyone. "Dad's not a bad person," she told me one night as we packed boxes. "He's just weak. I love him, but I don't respect him anymore." Those words hit hard. Our teenager had seen through her father's charm to the truth beneath. She'd learned a painful but valuable lesson about self-respect and boundaries. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings or even dividing up 20 years of shared possessions. It was facing our social circle. Some friends took sides immediately. Mark's golf buddies' wives stopped inviting me to their book club. A few couples we'd known for years awkwardly declined my dinner invitations, clearly uncomfortable with the new dynamic. But others surprised me. Claire from accounting, of all people, reached out. She'd left her job a decade ago because of Mark's behavior, but had been too ashamed to tell anyone the real reason. "He has a way of making you feel special," she said over coffee. "Like you're the only one who truly understands him. Then you find out you're just another chapter in his story." The single moms support group I joined became my lifeline. These women understood what I was going through because they'd lived it. They helped me navigate everything from finding a good therapist to setting up online dating profiles, though I wasn't ready for that yet. I found a townhouse in a quiet subdivision across town, close enough for Emily to stay at her same school, but far enough that I wouldn't run into Mark at the grocery store. The place needed work, but I discovered I enjoyed having projects that were just mine. No need to consult anyone else about paint colors or cabinet handles. My job at the university library, which had seemed stable but unexciting for years, suddenly offered new opportunities. Without Mark's constant neediness for attention and support, I had energy to focus on my career. Within months, I was promoted to head of digital archives, a position I'd been qualified for but had never pursued. The yoga studio became my sanctuary. 3 times a week, I'd roll out my mat and spend an hour focusing just on my breath and movement. The instructor, a serene woman named Maya, often spoke about finding strength in vulnerability. "When we acknowledge our pain," she'd say, "we can finally begin to heal." 6 months after moving out, I ran into Jessica at a coffee shop. 20 years had passed since college, but I recognized her immediately. She started to turn away, but I called her name. "I owe you an apology," she said, eyes downcast. "I was young and selfish, but that's no excuse." "You were 20, I replied. "He was the one who made vows to me. But I do have one question. Why did you come to our wedding?" She looked surprised. "Mark insisted. Said it would seem suspicious if we didn't." That's when I realized what kind of man he really was. That conversation was strangely healing. Jessica had been carrying her own guilt all these years, while Mark had simply added more lies to his collection. Emily thrived in our new environment. Her grades improved, and she started talking about applying to law schools. "I want to help people stand up for themselves," she said. "Like you did, Mom." A year after the divorce was finalized, I attended a library conference in Boston. The old Sarah would have declined, worried about leaving Emily or disrupting Mark's schedule. The new Sarah booked her ticket without hesitation. Emily was 18 now, preparing for college, and perfectly capable of handling a week alone. During the conference dinner, I found myself seated next to a history professor from Michigan State. David was a widower with grown children, in Boston to research colonial archives. He asked thoughtful questions about my work in digital preservation and actually listened to the answers. We ended up talking until the restaurant staff started stacking chairs. "I'd love to continue this conversation," he said, "but I respect that you might not be ready." That simple acknowledgement of my boundaries told me more about his character than a dozen dinners could have. We exchanged email addresses and over the next few months, developed a friendship through long messages about books, archives, and gradually, our lives. Mark's relationship with Jenny didn't last. She left him for a younger colleague 6 months after our divorce, a delicious irony I appreciated but didn't dwell on. He started showing up at Emily's events with a succession of dates, each younger than the last, while I focused on rebuilding myself. My parents eventually came around. Mom called one day in tears, apologizing for pushing me to stay in a bad situation. "I was wrong," she said. "Seeing you now, so strong and happy. I should have supported you from the start." The single moms group became more than just support, they became family. We celebrated promotions, helped each other move, watched each other's kids. Several of us started a weekend hiking club, tackling increasingly challenging trails. Standing on mountaintops, I felt a freedom I hadn't known existed. Emily left for college that fall, accepted to her dream school with a partial scholarship. The day we moved her into her dorm, she hugged me tight and whispered, "You taught me what real strength looks like, Mom." David and I continued our long-distance friendship, eventually meeting in person again at another conference. This time, when he asked if I'd like to have dinner, I said yes. We're taking things slowly, both of us carrying lessons from our past relationships. Last week, I found a box of old photos while cleaning. There was our wedding picture, with those 3 women smiling falsely in the background. I didn't feel anger anymore, just gratitude for the wake-up call that finally came. I put the photo back in the box and closed it. That evening, I met my hiking group for our weekly trail run. As we watched the sunset from our favorite overlook, I realized something. The woman who'd been so desperate to save her marriage wouldn't recognize me now. She couldn't imagine the joy of building a life on her own terms, the pride in showing her daughter what self-respect looks like, or the peace that comes with genuine relationships built on trust. "Ready to head back?" one of my friends asked. I took one last look at the setting sun. "Ready," I said, and I meant it in every possible way. At 44, I'm not just surviving after divorce, I'm finally living. My story isn't about Mark's betrayal anymore. It's about my journey to becoming the woman I was always meant to be. And this is just the beginning.